Good evening. Welcome to our Midweek Bible study. It's always a joy to be able to share together God's Word, to look at these things that are, frankly, in Daniel, very difficult to understand. There's portions of the book of Daniel that we enjoy. We've heard them for many of us since we're children. The lion's den, the fiery furnace, those are great stories. But then the last chapters of the book of Daniel deal with some of the things that are happening in the end times, actually the times including Daniel's life and forward, and Jesus' time and forward again. So those are periods of time that God has given to us. We're picking up in Daniel 11 where we left off, about verse 35, 36. And if you were with us last week, in fact, I have the outline with us. It's multiple pages. And what I tried to do is to bring to you some of the very specific ways that this word from Daniel, which was future to him, and its history to us as we look back at these events that are taking place. And so I wanted you to be able to kind of grasp that again. As you see, if you have this, it's available for you online. I encourage you to have it in hand because, frankly, if you just read it on your own without any kind of a commentary or explanation, something I'm giving to you today, it's going to be pretty hard to grasp all the things that are there. But one of the beautiful things about this is that Daniel said, I want to understand what's being said. I want an explanation. And I believe it's Gabriel that has come to him to give him that explanation so that he understands it as best he possibly can. And last week we looked at Daniel 11, verses 1 to about 35. And in that section, as I have it in my hand right here, in verses 1 and 2, it talks about the four kings that will rise up. And lo and behold, historically, you see those kings that rise up. I have them listed for you there. And then a mighty king will come after them in verses 3 and 4. And that mighty king is Alexander the Great. And you see that that is played out. And it's divided into four parts. You see the four kings that took place right there. And then there's a power struggle that happens in verses 5 through 13. I don't go into as much detail on the video or the PowerPoint, but you've got it all right there in the outline. You can see the various power struggles that were taking place of the north and the south, and the kings that are ruling there, and you can read all that detail for your own benefit and see those things taking place. And then in verses 14 through 19, the conflict continues between the north, the south, the coastland, all those things interplaying together, and he's prophesying some of the historical events to us, but the prophetical events to Daniel. Future to Daniel, past for us, until we come to this despicable person in verses 20 through 35, which turns out to be Antiochus Epiphanes the fourth. Some people called him Antiochus Epimanes. Epimanes means madman because he was a madman. And the beautiful thing, and the fascinating thing, at least to us, is that Antiochus Epiphanes is actually sort of a type of the Antichrist that will occur in the end times. 2 Thessalonians talks about him. Revelation 13 talks about him, amongst many other passages that speak of him as well. So he gives kind of a prefiguring of what the Antichrist will be like, and then we finally find ourselves down to about verse 35 and 36, and in verse 36 we begin to see the story of this future king that will rise up. And there's a change that takes place at this particular time. Now, let me just set the stage as to why now this is occurring after the previous events. Here's what always is important to remember in this chapter. In verses 1 through 35, we see historical events to us. Things happened in the past, future to Daniel, and we see that what was prophesied in 1 through 35 did occur. Daniel wouldn't have known that except from heaven. Maybe God told him about it. But Gabriel said, here's what's going to happen after you. We've seen that already in the book of Daniel in previous chapters as well, where he prophesied of the various kingdoms going to follow, the Persian kingdom, the Greece kingdom, the Roman kingdom, all these other kingdoms that were going to come along. And those kingdoms actually did occur. And here we see it again in greater detail as to how some of these powers, like the kingdom of Greece, was to take place. Now, over Greece and Persia are these princes of demonic power, these demons that are ruling over these lands, and they're manipulating all the massive destruction that's occurring there. And we see the role of Gabriel as a messenger, but also the role of Michael, the archangel that rescues him and helps him to be able to message to Daniel the the truth of God's word. So those are some backgrounds that have occurred. But the important thing is this. If what God said would happen in Daniel's day, and we can record that indeed it did happen in Daniel's, or after Daniel's day, if I should repeat, after Daniel, these things did occur. If then, therefore, God prophesies things that are future to you and to me, then we can say that those things are surely going to take place as well. So think of verses 1 through 35 to prove the veracity of what God says, that we can trust what he says, so that when he begins to speak to future events that seem, frankly, unlikely in a human way, Revelation 13, it's just hard to imagine those things, trust that God now is also speaking truth to you and me as he was to Daniel in his day. So here we are in the midweek Bible study. It's the courage to know that God is in control of the nations, and he was writing these things so that we could be encouraged, so that we can persevere, because times can become very difficult. And Daniel in his latter years of life, in chapters 10, 11, and 12, he's about 85 years of age, and it begins this time period, and it's marked by King Cyrus in 536 BC. And that's what we begin to see in Daniel 11. So let me fast forward now to actually the verses that we want. We looked at all those taking place. Antiochus Epiphanes comes along, and he creates this sense of peace. He redistributes the wealth to the people. And anybody that can come in and bring peace to the land and then give out money to help recruit followers to his leadership, that's the kind of thing that takes place with politicians these days. And sometimes I even wonder, is that happening to us today? But that's certainly the way that the Antichrist is going to do it, as well, as we'll see. So just note verses 23 and 24, because we want to maybe note that as we get back to it. And Antiochus does his ravaging that takes place. And the most notable thing that still occurs for us today is where Antiochus came in and he had this altar built to Zeus, and he made the Jewish people offer sacrifices. This pig is there in the temple, and it's just a horrible, horrible thing. That was happening, again, to the Jewish people. So often they are the victims of this bullying, persecution, harassments in the various forms that we see it. Even today, it's taking place. And then what happens is that the Maccabee family rises up and attacks him, and they bring about the defeat of this horrible thing to the temple. And Judas Maccabeus in particular comes along, 165, 164. BC, and they cleanse the temple, and God purifies that, and it becomes a sacred place once again. And even Hanukkah now celebrates some of the events that took place in that particular period of time. So we can see that these, again, were events that were prophesied to Daniel. We can have confidence because we look back and see that they indeed take place. And so now when we look into the future, we can trust what God says about that future event. I guess I said that numerous times now, but it's so key to understand why did we learn 1 through 35, so we can have confidence in verses 36 through 45. And so what we see is that all the previous events were happening after Daniel, before Jesus, and they were written about the Maccabean revolt that took place. But Gabriel assures Daniel in Daniel 10:21, this is the writing of truth. So what God says, and that's a wonderful little phrase, that what God says in the Word, in the Scriptures, is always a writing of truth, not to be pampered or changed in any form, added to, or deleted from, as the book of Revelation would talk about as well. So now we come to Daniel 11, verse 35 through 36, and let me highlight some of the things that are taking place there. And one of the key verses here to set this all up, let me read verses 35 and 36, says this: some of those who have insight will fall. So there are those who are being persecuted during the days of Antiochus Epiphanes. There were those Jewish people that fell during that time, but they rose up in a revolt to that in order to refine, purge, and make them pure. So it's a purifying thing that even in persecution, there's a greater purity. We see that in the book of Acts and the persecution of the Christians and the Jewish believers at that time, the Jewish and Gentile believers, I should say. And there's a purification of the church that would occur during those periods of time. One great chapter is 1 Peter chapter 1, comes to my mind right now, that talks about the purifying effect of the suffering of God's people. We don't like it. God's not pleased with it, but we know we live in a fallen world where it's going to occur. So during this persecution of Antiochus Epiphanes, there's this purging that takes place, and it says until the end time. So that's why I highlight that in yellow. Until the end time. He's looking forward now. He's moving us beyond Antiochus Epiphanes. He's moving us into the end times, because it is still to come at the appointed time. God has an appointed time for these events to occur. The last things, the what we call in fancy seminary speak, eschatology, the last things, the words that are last that are going to come to us. Then in verse 36, then, and I underline then the king will do as he pleases. So now we're changing degrees, we're changing course. We're changing the time in which these events are being prophesied, because the things that follow in verses 36 through 45, they do not correspond to Antiochus Epiphanes or his times, because he died then shortly after the purification by Judas Maccabeus. He died of insanity, and of course the Epimanes was an appropriate title as a madman that took place. He was insane, and then he will exalt. So this king, this new king that is now being introduced, will exalt him and magnify himself above every god, and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods, and he will prosper until the indignation is finished, for that which is decreed will be done. So it's setting the stage. That which is decreed will be done. So these end times, he's exalting himself. And so verses 36 through 45, to once again say it, because I have it on the screen, is that this future leader is going to rise up and be what Scripture calls the beast. We call him the Antichrist, but he is truly the false Christ, as the Antichrist label would suggest. And then Revelation 13 is another description of this particular person, but many parallels to Antiochus Epiphanes that we will see. So here are some of the things that these passages that I'm just talking about right here in verses 36 through 40 talk about. It says, let me read again, verse 36, then the king will do as he pleases. He will do as he pleases. He seeks his own counsel. He controls the world. He is in charge. He is controlling all religious activity as well. He will magnify himself above every god and will speak monstrous things against the God of gods. So he's going to blaspheme the God that you and I, hopefully you, I know we worship together. He's going to control all religious activities, and he will magnify himself. And it says here, he will prosper until the indignation is finished. This horrible tribulational period is finished. For that which is decreed will be done. So God says, I'm gonna let this happen. It's not going to be anything that anybody likes, but in the tribulation, much like I would call it the mini tribulation of the Jewish people during the Maccabean revolt, it was a purifying thing for them. The final tribulation is designed to be a purifying event for the people of the world, to bring people to God, for the final coming of Christ, so that things are as they should be according to his control. In verse 37, he will show no regard for the gods of his fathers or for the desire of women, nor will he show regard for any other god, for he will magnify himself above them all. But instead, he will honor a God of fortresses, a God whom his fathers did not know. He will honor him with gold, silver, costly stones, and treasures. He will take strong action against the strongest of fortresses with the help of a foreign god. He will give great honor to those who acknowledge him. He will cause them to rule over the many, and will parcel out a land for a price. Now look at some of these qualities. I listed them on the screen. They're on your outline as well. I already said he will do as he pleases. He is his own boss. He is an autocratic authoritarian. He's a dictator. He's totalitarian in his rule. And so he's going to rule over all the religious activity in the world. And all activity has to be pointed towards him. And what he says is the only thing that matters in respect to religious activity. He will magnify himself above every god. He will set himself up as a god to be worshipped. He will blaspheme the one true God. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 is also a description of this time and the events that are occurring there. He will initially prosper for 3.5 years, because this is part of the 7-year period of time. And he will deceive people with power and miracles. I'm going to look at that a little bit later. And he will rule against his power. He will rule using his power and wealth to manipulate people. And again, these are the things that we see. We see little and not to get lost on the politics of today and the things that are occurring. But even during this pandemic, we have seen just little glimpses of how this could work. How can he rule over all religious activity? How can he help give us money so that we can trust him more? How can he manipulate through wealth and distribute? It says here, he will acknowledge him and cause them to rule over the many, and will parcel out land for a price. He will give money to those that support him. He controls them through the use of money. And this goes in this whole thing of when we battle socialism and communism that tried to work, and all that did is to allow the people at the top to get all the wealth and the people at the bottom to not have as much wealth and to be dependent upon those people at the top as money would be parceled out to them. We see glimpses of that in the pandemic as it controlled, frankly, some of the religious activities around the world. It was global in its vast rule over us. And you can see little glimpses. I'm not saying we're in the last times, not even close. I don't think it's anything to do with the kind of things that are being described here. But you get glimpses of how that could happen. To have another pandemic, to have some sort of chaotic situation that rises up. And then a leader comes along, and what the Antichrist is going to do is he's going to be a man of peace. He's going to resolve the issues, and people are going to say, wow, we need this guy to be in control. And this is what he's talking about. He will do as he pleases. He will control all religious activity. He will control the money and the giving of money. He will control all those things that we depend upon to be able to function in a normal society. And so government becomes powerful, the people become less powerful, and people to become dependent upon the government, and the religious activities are dependent upon what the government allows. We're seeing pastors being arrested and persecuted and fined because they're actively practicing their faith, and the government says no. The pandemic causes them to think they have more power to control all religious activity. So we see glimpses of it today. I'm hesitant to go down that road too far, but it just gives you a little bit of a picture of how it could happen in terms of some sort of a very difficult time in which government comes and brings peace. And we say, wow, good for you. And we lose a few privileges, lose a few rights and freedoms. That's okay, because government has brought peace. That's what the Antichrist is going to do. He's going to come along and prosper. It's kind of interesting here. And I don't think anybody really knows what this means, but kind of an interesting thing here. He will show no regard, here in verse 37. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers. So traditions of faith are washed out. He doesn't care what has happened in the past. He doesn't care how churches or synagogues or mosques or any other religious activity is being done. He casts that all aside because he's more interested in the kind of religion he wants to enforce upon people. So there's no tradition of faith that is now to be passed on. We're all sort of starting fresh depending upon what he allows, what freedoms he encourages in our lives. So, and then it also says here, or for the desire of women. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers or for the desire of women. Some people believe that I don't know what the truth is on this. Let me show you what here's a couple of versions of what does it mean, or for the desire of women. One commentator I read said that there are women that look to him and that maybe she could be this woman, or women, they could be the next mother of the coming Messiah, that somehow that they would wish for that for him. Others say that, or for the desire of women, that it means he must be homosexual. I don't know what it means, but it's just a confusing statement in the midst of all these things that suggests something of a gender dysphoria that is going on here, where he has alignment in his gender orientation. In today's world, it's kind of a believable thing that might be occurring, but maybe there's something in that realm. I have no idea, but just throwing it out there to let you know that I don't want to gloss over it, but people just don't know exactly what that means. But those are some of the things that commentators are saying about that particular passage. But he's going to use his military might, he's going to use his power, he's going to use the armies that he will have under his control, and he will enforce his will upon us. He will honor a God of fortresses, a God whom his fathers did not know. So he uses military power to accomplish his will. And we see that in various countries today. China is a good example of that. Iran is another good example of that. They use their military power to keep people under their control. And in fact, China is a wonderful example of the kinds of things that are happening here in this particular passage, of using money to manipulate people, military power to control people, and really, in fact, China is trying to shut down all churches over there. They won't allow a hard copy of the Bible to be distributed in China anymore, and they're getting rid of all Bible apps over there, according to the news that's coming out even just last week. And so they are truly forcing, I should say, people to no longer honor the gods of their fathers, the traditions of their faith, the way that they want to exercise their Christian freedoms that they might have had in the past. So you can see a little bit of China at work here. Now let me move along at verses 40 through 44. It says, "At the end time, the king of the south will collide with him. The king of the north will storm against him with chariots, with horsemen, with many ships, and he will enter countries, overflow them, and pass through them." So there's this, again, just like with Antiochus Epiphanes, there's this power of the north, there's the power of the south, of the north of the area of Syria and some of those regions that we know of today. And the power of the king of the south would be Egypt and some of the northern African nations that are going to occur. And at the end time, this king of this north and the south will come and attack them in the coastland that is there along the land of Israel as well. And he will enter the beautiful land, and many countries will fall. So he's going to overwhelm those countries that are out there. And then he will stretch out his hand against other countries, but the land of Egypt will not escape. So he's going to ravage into the land of Egypt, as it will have a power base back at that time, much as it was back in the days of Moses. And then he will gain control over the hidden treasures of gold and silver, over the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians, again, sort of the northern Africa territories as well. But rumors from the east and from the north will disturb him, and he will go forth with great wrath to destroy and annihilate many. So this is heading to Armageddon. This is heading to the final war of wars that is going to take place during that land. And some of the characteristics of this trait was that the beast will hear of attacks from the north and the south. He becomes disturbed about that. The beautiful land is the land of Israel. So he will put up his main camp there in Jerusalem in particular. Actually, he would spend time in Israel and would go over to Europe and come back because of the war that is threatening him. Then the beast will hear of an attack from the east. It says here that the attack from the east and the north in verse 44. And you can see a reference to that in Revelation 9:16. I'll read that in just a moment. But there's a 200 million man march that's going to go where the Euphrates River allows them to pass through and come and attack. And some people believe that's China, 200 million in their army already. If it's China or it's something from the east, that's all that we need to know at this point. But it's massive, and it's coming against him. Again, the Battle of Armageddon, the latter years of the tribulational period, the last 3.5 years. The beast will set up his headquarters in Jerusalem between the seas it talks about here. He will pitch the tents of his royal pavilion between the seas, and between the seas would refer to the Mediterranean Sea and the Dead Sea that is there in that place. And the holy mountain would be where Jerusalem is, and yet he will come to his end and no one will help him. And so that will include Christ coming back to destroy him. So this is the last days, and it's a real quick snapshot of those last days as you see it summarized by Daniel. And again, Daniel, remember that's going on here. Already 1 through 35, he's predicted certain things that we can look back and yes, indeed, those things occurred. So now when we look at these, as improbable as they might seem to us these days, and the naming of these countries and the powers that are raging around them, then we can trust that these things indeed will take place. And they can be verified by other passages. Look at Revelation 9:16. It talks about the armies from the east, and it says there in 9:16, the number of the armies of the horsemen was 200 million. I heard a number of them. That is no time, there's no time in the history of mankind where that has occurred before. That's prophetically looking ahead in Revelation 9. Revelations 8 and 9 are the prophetic words of the key points, the terrible times of the tribulation. 6, 8, 9, and 16 are those chapters that advance the storyline of the tribulational period, and here's 9 right in the middle of that. Then Zechariah 14 is this great account of how when he comes to his end, yet he will come to his end and no one will help him. That's because Jesus comes back. Zechariah 14 says, "Behold, a day is coming for the Lord when the spoil taken from you will be divided amongst you. And for I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle." And this is what we see taking place here from the north, the south, the east, and all these converging forces. Ezekiel 38 talks about the Gog and Magog, the powers of the north as well. And you can even see how Iran and Russia and China, they could have some sort of a coalition that's going on there. None of them like Israel. They're all anti-Semitic in so many different ways. And the religious fervor of those that really follow Yahweh from Jerusalem and the sacred places that are there, they have no regard for those sacred places in the way that believers would, and the very faithful Jewish people would as well. Even the Muslims that they're at the mosque as well as the Dome of the Rock, very sacred locations. And so these nations are going to come converge upon this area that is taking place, and the city will be captured, the houses plundered, the women ravaged, and the half of the city exiled, but the rest of the people will not be cut off from the city. So this is the conversion where he lands. His camp is in Jerusalem, and this holy place, the beautiful land that he talks about here, Daniel does. Then the Lord will go forth and fight against these nations as when he fights in the day of battle, Revelation 19, where he comes and returns to this battle place. And in that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, and this is the second coming of Christ as he stands placed upon the Mount of Olives in a miraculous, huge event that occurs, which is in front of Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives will be split in its middle from east to west by a very large valley, so that half of the mountain will move toward the north and the other half will move to the south. And what's going to happen from other passages that I'm not going to go to right now, but there's going to be this river that will flow, there's going to be this new temple that's going to be built, there's going to be a place of worship, and the water is going to flourish, and the desert that is parched in many ways will become a beautiful paradise once again, and this righteous kingdom that Christ will establish is going to be a very brand new way in which God is honored in his son Jesus Christ as people flock to this place to worship him. So it's a big topographical change that will take place. Geographical changes will be taking place, and a righteous kingdom will be established. But let me just wrap up with this in Revelation 13, because it's interesting the parallels of these things that take place at this particular time that Daniel talks about. But if you want to turn to Revelation 13, I'm going to go through this very quickly, but notice some of the traits that are here in Revelation 13 that is descriptive of some of the things that the Antichrist will do, that Antiochus Epiphanes would try to do. But in chapter 13, verses 1 and 2, it says, "But the dragon stood on the sand of the seashore," and so the dragon is Satan himself. "And then I saw a beast," this is the Antichrist, "coming up out of the sea." So some people believe that he was a Gentile. Coming out of the sea would connote a Gentile place, but we don't know. And he is given this power by these other coalition of powers that are there, having 10 horns and 7 heads. On his horns were 10 diadems, and his heads were blasphemous names. And the beast which I saw was like a leopard, and his feet were like those of a bear, and the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him power and his throne and a great authority. And note that what we have read in Daniel about these, the leopard, the bear, and the the lion, I should say, and it talks about Persia, it talks about Greece, it talks about Rome. And so you can see this correlation between book of Daniel and book of Revelation, using the same metaphors, images of the powers that will prop up this Antichrist, and he'll be a powerful authoritarian that will rule over them. Then verses 3 through 4 says, "And I saw one of his heads as if it had been slain, and the fatal wound was healed. And the whole earth was amazed and followed after the beast. They worshiped the dragon because he gave his authority to the beast. And they worshiped the beast, saying, 'Who is like the beast, and who is able to wage war against him?'" So everybody's propping him up, and he has this amazing healing. Some people believe it's a nation that rises up again. I'm prone to believe that the fatal wound was healed of a particular person, and he doesn't really die, but it looks like a fatal wound. Later on, it talks about a sword doing this, and he's given new life. And people love to see miracles and signs, and they're driven by that, as we see a little bit later in this chapter. But he's this charismatic ruler that people flock to, because he's just the perfect person that people have been waiting to see in power, that brings peace and brings power to play as he rules. But in verses 5 through 6, it says, there was given to him a mouth speaking arrogant words and blasphemies. Again, just like we saw in Daniel 11. And authority to act for 42 months was given to him. So he's at half of the time of the 7 years of tribulation. He opened his mouth in blasphemies against God, to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, that is, those who dwell in heaven. So he's going to blaspheme, and he's going to bring false doctrine. He's going to bring deception to the people. And that's why it's so important that we have the biblical understanding, a true understanding and knowledge of biblical truth, so that we don't fall into the trap of the blasphemies, the things that are said about God that are not true about God. But he's going to come in with his own false doctrine to counter the truth of those things that we should already know. And then there was going to only be one church. It was given to him to make war with the saints, to overcome them. The believers are going to be the victims of this persecution, and authority over every tribe, people, tongue, and nation was given to him. Because in heaven there will be people of every tribe, people, tongue, and nation. We see that in Revelation 4 and 5 that takes place. And all who dwell on the earth will worship him, and everyone whose name was not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life. And there's that book of life. We're going to talk about that next week in Daniel 12. There is a book, and it shows those who have life. And we'll show you some of the passages that talk about that book of life. So we'll get to that when it's time. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is destined for captivity, to captivity goes. If anyone kills with a sword, he must be killed. Here's the perseverance and the faith of the saints. And so he's just letting us know that there's going to be this one person rule that's going to overwhelm everybody. And then there's going to be this false prophet that's going to come along as well. In verse 11, then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth. He had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spoke as a dragon. So again, irony of irony, the false prophet is going to be like a lamb, Jesus, the Lamb of God, of course. And he's going to have this kind of power where he exercises all authority of the first beast. So there's the Antichrist, and there's the false prophet. There's the beast, and there's this lamb, if you will, that spoke as a dragon. In his presence, and he makes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, whose fatal wound was healed. And he's going to bring about this experiential relationship with God. Here in verses 11 and then verse 13, he performs great signs so that he even makes fire come down out of heaven to the earth, to the presence of men, and he deceives those who dwell on the earth because of the signs which was given to him to perform in the presence of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast who had the wound of the sword. And there's the sword that caused what looked to be like a fatal wound that Satan healed has come to life. And the thing that strikes me about that is that people in that day are going to be driven by experiential feelings and signs. The biblical truth of understanding will be lost on them, but they're attracted to what makes them feel good, which is an experiential sign. He's got all these miracles that he's performing that are deceiving people, and think, well, how can this not be true? Look at what's happened to the people around me. And I fear that there's a tendency for us, and even in today's world, where we're driven by experience and feelings and signs and wonders. They're great if they're from God and they're miraculous, and it's truly we can verify from the hand of God. But to be misled by them and to think that this person who can perform those things or lead us into that, it's a very dangerous world if it's not backed up by biblical truth. The core message of the gospel and all the scriptures that were written for our benefit to live a godly and righteous life. And then there'll be full monetary and control. He causes all the small, the great, the rich, the poor, the freeman, the slave to be given a mark on their right hand or on their forehead. And he provides that no one will be able to buy or sell except the one who has the mark, either the name of the beast or the number of the beast. And there goes the 666. I'm not going to get into that, but I just want to emphasize with the last thing that's much like Antiochus Epiphanes did. It's much like the Antichrist will do, using money to control people. And if you don't have the right credentials, you're not going to be able to buy and sell. If you don't have the mark of the beast, you're not going to be able to sell. Now, I'm going to say something that could be taken the wrong way, but let me just give you kind of a little glimpse of this, which is not that, but it's a glimpse of that. Let's just say that the government of the United States finally said, you know what, you need to have a vaccine passport, and you need to show that when you go to Albertsons, or when you go to REI, you go to Dick's Sporting Goods, you go to buy a car, a Chevrolet or a Ford, you need to prove that we're not going to let you in until you have that vaccine passport. And we're not going to let you travel on airplanes. You cannot go to another country. We may not even let you go to another city or another state unless you go through the roadblocks that control all those things. Now, obviously, I'm exaggerating that. They're not going to do the vaccine passports from what I'm told. But you can just imagine that there's that discussion that's going on. It's not going to happen. But what if it did? What if the government in the last days of the Antichrist said, I'm not going to let you do anything unless you have this passport. And this passport has to be given to those who have an allegiance to the Antichrist, who are somehow proven to be his followers, and you swear off the God of gods, Jesus Christ himself, and prove that you have an obedience and a submission to the God that is the Antichrist. You can't do anything without that passport. So you see a little bit of a glimpse of how that could work if they enforced it through military control, as we see that will take place. And you can't have money unless you have these credentials as well. So you get a little taste of that, and it's nothing going on about the last times today, just stuff that we're always concerned about, always alert to, but not to be preoccupied, because there's a lot of stuff that we need to be doing to lead people to Jesus Christ, to live godly and holy lives today, to worship the Lord, serve the Lord, to have a positive impact, to be salt and light to the community around us. So we can't get lost on the what ifs, but because we have to do what is now the requirement in obedience to what God has called us to. But it's interesting to understand the signs of the times and to know the deception that can occur in some of these character traits are those things to be alert to, even today, even if it's not the Antichrist, but not be falling into those traps, but to be obedient to all that God has asked of us. Well, that's Daniel 11, Revelation 13. It's a lot of stuff, I know. And you might have to run through it a couple times, but look at the outline that's available for you as well. Daniel 12 is next week. It's the last chapter in the book. We'll see how long it takes to get through that chapter. It may be just 1 or 2 sessions. We'll see how it goes. But thank you for being on this difficult journey. Thank you for listening. It's so hard to follow along. I understand. It's even hard for me to process it in my own brain as well. But thank you for being part of this study. Let me pray for us. God, thank you for your truth, your word. As Gabriel says, the writing of truth, Lord, it is your truth. Help us to be obedient. Help us to be knowledgeable. Help us to be students and grow in our understanding of those things that you still require of us today. As Peter says, after the end times, so then how should we live? To live spotless and blameless, pure, holy lives for your sake. So help us to be that way today. In Jesus' name, amen. See you next week.